from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Tonight, war and peace. President Trump is threatening bad things if Iran refuses a deal as a second U.S. aircraft carrier nears the region. Could a strike come as soon as this weekend? Former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper joins us shortly with the War Room perspective.
And kitchen table issues as tensions flare overseas. President Trump pivots back home to the economy with an affordability-focused speech in Georgia ahead of next week's State of the Union. More on his economic message and how Democrats are pushing back. All ahead.
And tension over tariffs, a tariff fight spilling into public view as Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashkari blasts Kevin Hassett's attack on Fed research. The back and forth comes ahead of a highly anticipated ruling from the Supreme Court on presidential tariff power. Bloomberg's Greg Stohr joins us this hour with what to expect and when.
For the latest now from the White House, we turn to Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, who is live on the North Lawn. Kate, President Trump speaking in Georgia about a very different topic than he began the day with his celebration of the new Board of Peace. It's the pivot back to affordability. Rome, Georgia, the district formerly held by Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I know it's wrapped by a couple of interviews and other media events, all gearing up to the big speech next week. Did this White House finally make the pivot to affordability?
His top aides certainly hope so. So the president just started speaking a few moments ago in Rome, Georgia, and this speech was certainly billed as one that is supposed to focus on the economy and affordability. I'd expect to hear a lot on those themes next week as well in the State of the Union. But so far we've heard him touting the tariffs. Certainly something that is top of mind as the Supreme Court reconvenes tomorrow and as we're awaiting a decision on the tariffs and the future of the tariffs there. But he's still speaking, and we'll see what he actually ends up focusing on. As you know, Joe, a lot of the news that the president makes comes in these off-the-cuff moments that are not scripted. But one person who was not at the speech today is former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. There is a crowded field of candidates to replace her in a special election there. She had a pretty explosive falling out with the president, as you know. Curious to see if the president attacks her on her home turf there. But in addition to the special election, urging Republican voters to get out and vote, this is definitely part of a broader campaign strategy ahead of the midterm elections. His top aides want the president to be focusing on domestic issues, the economy, affordability. So certainly hope he is expected to focus on those things today in his speech.
All right, Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan reporting from the White House North Lawn. Thank you so much. Now, as Joe mentioned, before President Trump departed for Georgia, he hosted the inaugural Board of Peace meeting here in Washington, sharing details of the pledges that the group has made for humanitarian and reconstruction efforts in Gaza. The talk of peace was coupled with talk of war today, as the president issued a warning to Iran.
Iran is a hot spot right now. Good talks are being had. It's proven to be, over the years, not easy to make a meaningful deal with Iran. We have to make a meaningful deal. Otherwise, bad things happen. And we do have some work to do with Iran. They can't have a nuclear weapon. It's very simple. You can't have peace in the Middle East if they have a nuclear weapon.
The Wall Street Journal now reporting that the president is weighing an initial limited military strike on Iran to pressure it to meet his demands for a nuclear deal, but stops short of a full-scale attack that could be met with retaliation. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Eric Martin, who is here with us in our D.C. studio. So, Eric, pretty striking to see a president who, on the one hand, is touting peace and this initiative with the Board of Peace, but also could be any day now, realistically, pulling the trigger on conflict with Iran.
Well, that's absolutely true. I'm just back from a trip to Europe with Secretary of State Marco Rubio. We got to speak to him there, and he talked about how President Trump always prefers a negotiation and getting a deal, and that while he's prepared to use military action, he would always prefer to reach a deal. We've seen this timeline laid out, but at the same time, 2 aircraft carriers, any number of planes, a lot of assets being dedicated to the Gulf and to that part of the world in an attempt to, appears as far as right now, to pressure Iran into a deal. And that's what some of this Wall Street Journal reporting is getting at, is the idea that that maximum pressure campaign could even include an initial limited strike in order to try to greater incentivize a deal from Tehran.
What does a deal look like, though, Eric? I guess remains the question. Is this specific to ending the country's nuclear program, or would it include the ballistic missile program, or something even wider than that?
Well, we've seen U.S. officials say multiple things. We've heard the president talk about his willingness to potentially do a deal that would be limited to Iran's nuclear program. We've also heard the Secretary of State talk about the priority of getting Iran to drop its support for proxies in the region, as well as to curtail its missile program. And so we're hearing varying things, and it's not really apparent exactly what the landing zone will be, but that what we do know is Iran has not in the past been easy to deal with, has not necessarily been willing to honor deals or even agree to deals, in part because, as the Secretary of State said, they're so driven by this Islamic fundamentalism and their interpretation of Islam that makes it hard to reach a deal in terms of practical incentives and Iran as a rational actor agreeing to a deal and negotiating.
Just back in the U.S. with fresh reporting, Bloomberg's Eric Martin. We thank you, Eric, and joining us now with his insights. Another voice of experience, Mark Esper, is back with us on Bloomberg. Of course, the former Secretary of Defense in the first Trump administration. Secretary, it's been some time. It's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I wonder your thoughts on this strategy of a bloody nose strike, as I think that was referred to in the first Trump administration when it was considered for North Korea. Is this the path to a deal?
Well, first of all, Joe, great to be with you and Kayleigh this evening. And talk about these many issues. Look, you have to begin with what's the purpose of the strikes, right? Is it to force the Iranians to come to the negotiation table and be more forthright with regard to what they will do and what we're asking them to do? I suspect that is the purpose, and that's what we should be pushing upon them. Of course, we still have lingering out there the president's promise to support the Iranian people who rose up just last month, of which several thousand were killed. But the idea of a bloody nose strike, I think, is one option being presented to the president. You know, when I sat in the role of Secretary of Defense, your job is to present multiple options based on what the president may be thinking of doing as his end state. And so the bloody nose option is one. The question then is, what does he go after to do this? And I know people talk about the regime, the Ayatollah, maybe the president, Pezeshkian. I frankly think they should go after the IRGC. The IRGC really is the power behind the throne these days, increasingly so, and likely would be somebody from the ranks who would come to power if Khomeini is displaced, and certainly when he passes. And so, to me, striking against the IRGC, who's also been brutal and has suppressed the Iranian people, to me, that would be the place to strike.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so, sir, if we're thinking about optionality here, knowing the hardware that has been widely reported that is now available in the Middle East, obviously more fighter jets have arrived, refueling aircraft. There is a second carrier strike group en route right now to the region. Would it be prudent to wait until the Jerry Ford and the accompanying vessels have arrived there, or can the president make a move prior to that?
Yeah, look, I would recommend waiting. As I used to say to the president, we own the shot clock here. So I would allow the carrier to come in. It's reportedly in the Western Mediterranean right now, cruising with 5 additional destroyers. Those destroyers, by the way, are important because they can help defend not only the carrier, but our neighbors and our friends in the region. So each of those destroyers include dozens of air defense missiles that could help defend Jordan, help defend Israel, help defend other countries who are supporting us. So to me, it's worth the wait. The other one thing political, too, Kayleigh, is, look, the president has the State of the Union coming up early next week. I don't think you want to step on your own message. He's out there now talking about affordability, as one of your reporters teed up in the opening. His advisors want him to talk more about affordability. The American people want to hear about affordability. Emphasize that at the State of the Union message, and don't overshadow it with a preemptive strike or a strike on Iran. Would be a political rationale as well to delay.
Okay. I'd like to hear from you on the rationale, as we saw surrounding the strike in Venezuela and the capture of Maduro. Congressional authorization, or maybe even just congressional consultation. There is a War Powers Act that's being drafted. In fact, I believe there are several of them in each chamber. Secretary, we heard from Marco Rubio following Venezuela that it was not prudent to give Congress a heads up or consult with the Gang of Eight because it was a trigger-based operation. Those were the words that he used in his congressional testimony. I'm guessing, as a former defense secretary, you're sympathetic to that view. And would that be the case this time as well with Iran? Should Congress get a heads up, or does that put troops in harm's way?
Look, I think it depends on the situation, Joe. Clearly now we have the ramping up of forces. We seem to be lurching toward some type of confrontation with Iran again, not the first time. It happened during my time. It happened, obviously, last June with Operation Midnight Hammer. There's nothing that says you can't go up and consult about the forces you're moving into the area, the things you're thinking about. There is prudence in doing those types of things. But, of course, it does depend on the situation, the timing, the risk, the mission, the risk, the force. Two things we always focused on at the Pentagon with regard to how much detail you give and when. And certainly after the operation commences, I think it's important to go to both sides of the aisle, both houses of Congress, and speak to them about what you're doing, because ultimately you want to get the Congress and inevitably the American people on your side to support an operation, particularly one against Iran, which could extend itself for days, if not weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and when we think about the prospect of this being a more prolonged conflict than just one strike, one de-escalatory retaliatory measure and being done with it, when we think about what Iran did in response to the strikes on the nuclear facilities back in June, they did send some missiles toward Al Udeid Air Force Base in Qatar, but there was plenty of forewarning. Nothing really catastrophic happened, obviously. Do you see that the Iran retaliatory scenario would be much more serious now? Could we actually be talking about American lives that are not just at risk, but potentially lost?
I think American lives are always at risk. That's why these things should not be taken lightly. And that's why I spoke about not just risk of mission, but risk to the force. So, yes, the Iranians will retaliate. That's just how they are. Keep in mind, when we killed Soleimani in early 2020, they retaliated by shooting ballistic missiles at one of our bases in northern Iraq. So they will respond to some degree of proportionality based on how big our assault, our attack was. And of course, they don't want the fight to continue. So they will, to the domestic audience, claim some sort of victory, and then behind the scenes reach out and want to stand down. That seems to be their MO, and I suspect that's what will happen again. But nonetheless, I think the administration is doing the right thing by taking their time and making sure our defenses are built up, that we are maybe moving troops and resources around the region, and be prepared for that because we have the time to do so.
There's some special irony, Secretary, as we're having this conversation. The same day we witnessed the inaugural meeting of President Trump's Board of Peace. He spoke to the leaders who came to Washington, some of them unlikely for a body like this, depending on who you ask. Here's what the president said.
In terms of power and in terms of prestige, there's never been anything close, because these are the greatest world leaders. Almost everybody's accepted, and the ones that haven't will be. And some are playing a little cute. It doesn't work. You can't play cute with me. But they're playing a little bit. But they're all joining. Everybody, most of them very immediately.
So far, about 60 invitations have been sent to heads of state. About 24 countries have agreed to join. You've seen the names: Orban, Lukashenko, Putin. Are these men of peace?
Well, I'd like to go back first to your first comment, Joe, and that is talking about an irony here. And look, I would say there's been no greater enemy to peace in the Mideast than Iran for the past 40 plus years. And that includes Iraq under Saddam Hussein. That includes Yemen, you name it. Nobody has caused more harm, more mischief in the Middle East and beyond than Iran. And to connect the dots here between the Board of Peace, which of course rose up out of the Gaza ceasefire and the agreement, the 20-some point plan between Israel and Gaza. Keep in mind, Iran continues to funnel money and resources and support to Hamas. And Hamas is still, waging some measure of conflict there in the region. They are asserting themselves in Gaza. They are threatening other Palestinians. So, look, the notion of bringing this group together is noble. Obviously, you want to expand the membership as much as possible. We need to get the Europeans on board, more of our Asian partners. And I think the more we can round it out and get support and focus on what's happening in Gaza, I think that would be a good thing.
Well, finally, Mr. Secretary, as we consider what you are describing as the kind of destructive force that the Iranian regime has been in the Middle East, if the end goal here is regime change, or if it's not the end goal, if it is the end result, could that not also result in what could be a prolonged, dangerous power vacuum? Could that actually increase, at least for a time, instability in the region?
Oh, absolutely, Kayleigh. And I think the experts would say that the odds are that the successor to the Khamenei regime is going to be a hardliner as equal to or greater than Khamenei. So it could be more likely than not somebody from the Islamic Republic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So those are the concerns. And that's why, I think if you were to step back and strategically think about this, what you want to do is prepare a much broader game plan. You'd want to use soft power in addition to hard power. You want to get as many allies on board, certainly in the region, but more broadly in Europe. You'd want to begin with sanctions to cut off the regime's ability to generate revenue that funds their war machine, that funds their activities throughout the region through the proxies. There's a playbook by which you go about and do this and try and at least promote the toppling of the regime into the hands of maybe some type of organized opposition. And it would be good, hopefully, covertly, we and others are doing that now, trying to organize the opposition in Iran so that somebody can step in and take charge once the regime falls. But again, even if the political regime falls, the civilians, the IRGC, if left intact, will be there to take over and really rule in a very hardline way and to continue to oppress the Iranian people.
Well, and of course, that is where you, as a former defense secretary, would recommend striking. We'll see what happens here, sir. Thank you very much for joining us. Mark Esper, former defense secretary in the first Trump administration. We appreciate it. And those escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran sending oil prices to the highest level since last August. For the details, let's turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who's joining us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine.
Yeah, this is one of those days where geopolitics really did matter most for the broader markets here in the U.S. You see that reflected in the slight downdraft that we saw in U.S. equities. Oil prices, as you said, Katie, down, at least here in WTI, down to back to the highest, I should say, up back to the highest. Thank you. I got it. Since July and August of last year here. We should also point out that some of the shippers in this space, like Frontline, one of the biggest U.S.-based publicly traded shippers, actually gaining just a bit on the back of that as well. The VIX, which of course prices in investors' expectations for future volatility in equities, that rose as well, back above the 20 handle. That flight into safe havens like gold, that resumed as well. On an intraday basis, you actually saw spot gold trade back above $5,000 an ounce. And then if you really want a sense, Kaylee, you should take a look at what defense stocks have been doing. As a group, they're up for a fifth straight day, and that's, of course, the big ones, like your Northrop's, RTXs as well. But there's also another index that tracks, I guess, more modern, if you will, defense companies. A lot of these defense tech drone makers, like Kratos and a few others, all rallying now for the fifth time in the past 6 sessions here. There does seem to be some speculation right now that if there was a follow-through on some of the threats with regards to Iran, that these are maybe not necessarily the growth plays, but at least in the short term, the safer havens.
Romaine, we were spending this time yesterday talking about the potential for rate hikes this year after the Fed minutes came out. Now we're hearing from Stephen Myron, fewer rate cuts on a better labor market. He made the remarks in an interview with the Substack blog, The Peg.
Yeah.
I don't know what's happening before our eyes, but what's the market make of it?
Well, I know what's happening. He left the Trump administration, right? No, in all seriousness, there's been a lot of discussion here about the idea of sort of what is being articulated publicly by members of the administration and what they really believe in terms of that. I don't know what to interpret. I don't know what goes on in Myron's head, whether this is a true flip-flop or whether he's always felt this. But the market right now, Joe, at least based on the pricing, is now starting to become comfortable with this idea that we may not get a rate cut anytime soon. That does not necessarily think that we're going to get rate hikes, but the idea that coming into this year, we can expect 2, 3, maybe 4 rate cuts, at least for right now, most investors have pushed that to the side.
A little time on the Fed changes everything. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, thank you, sir. Great to see you, as always. Coming up, we're less than a week out from the State of the Union. New Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger is now set to deliver the Democratic response. We're going to talk it out with Bloomberg Opinions' Nia-Malika Henderson next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
What word have you not heard over the last 2 weeks? Affordability. Because I've won. I've won affordability.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew. We've been listening to President Trump. That was just moments ago in Rome, Georgia, delivering a speech, another one on affordability, less than a week out from the State of the Union address. These remarks coming as both Republicans and Democrats, of course, try to shape their party's messaging ahead of this year's midterms. And this might have been a bit of workshopping ahead of the big speech to a joint session of Congress next week. Joining us now in our Washington bureau with her take on this, Bloomberg opinion columnist Nia-Malika Henderson. It's great to see you.
Good to see you.
I don't know if we're going to hear that next Tuesday, but we haven't used the word affordability in 2 weeks because he won the war on affordability.
That's right. It's solved.
It's a tough message to send right
happy.
now. What if Joe Biden said that 2 years ago? He was in a very similar place.
Yeah, and essentially, that was Joe Biden's problem, right? Saying, hey, look at these numbers and the unemployment rate and all that. And it's a feeling, right? And, you know, there's this term that people are using now, this whole idea of a boom session, that some people are doing quite well, you know, sort of the upper income earners, and then sort of the lower economic strata struggling with healthcare costs, housing costs, and grocery prices. The old-fashioned word that Donald Trump talks about is, because he doesn't go grocery shopping. So, yeah, I mean, this is part of what the White House wants to do, fan out Donald Trump, send him out on the road, and other cabinet officials, right? But the problem with speech, like when you're explaining to people that the economy is good and they're having to go to the Winn-Dixie or the Piggly Wiggly, and they can tell that the number of bags they get now for $100 is not the same amount of bags that they got, a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago, it just isn't working. But I think you are going to see him continue to declare victory on this.
Well, and you point to other cabinet members who were gathered with Susie Wiles, the chief of staff at the Capitol Hill Club earlier this week, basically for a lecture. This is what we have to talk about. Are there better surrogates or spokespeople for this message than President Trump himself, to Joe's point, seems to not be willing to agree that affordability is a serious problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone else, but I think also the problem is you can't contradict the head messenger, right? He's the one who's going to take up all the oxygen. He's the one that, quite frankly, is going to be angry if there's another cabinet member out there saying something different. So it's a real problem that they have. And obviously, this is a preview in some ways for the State of the Union, but I think we sort of know where he's going to go with this in terms of affordability.
I can't imagine how a lot of that speech is going to play in the room next Tuesday night. I believe you'll be with us to help us figure that out in real time. But let's go back to the last administration again. The parallels here are striking on this particular issue on affordability. What can President Trump, aside from the obvious, change your tone on this? What can he learn from Joe Biden when there's still time in this midterm cycle?
I think one of the things that he needs to do more consistently is actually pay attention to this, right? So if you look at a lot of the polling, people feel like he isn't paying attention to this. He's doing everything else. He's remodeling the White House. He's putting up an arch in D.C. And possibly going to war with Iran. Right. And people at least want him to take it seriously, at least focus on it. And that, of course, is not what Biden did, and that's why Biden lost. And so he is. And in some ways, I think it's sort of too late to turn this ship around because people expected results, and they see this as a president who's been distracted and not focusing on the bread and butter issues.
We have less than a minute left here, but we know the president will be giving the State of the Union address. We now know Governor Abigail Spanberger of Virginia will give the Democratic response. What do you think of the choice?
It's a smart choice because she won in November. She can talk about the ways in which Virginia, for instance, has been hurt by a lot of the things that this president has done, the government cutbacks and the shutdowns and all that. So, yeah, she's sort of the exact opposite of Donald Trump. She's a woman. She's younger. She's obviously more of a centrist. She's a Democrat. So I think it's a smart choice for the Democrats to put her forward. And then Alex Padilla, who, of course, is the senator from California, he's going to be giving a response in Spanish.
Yep. And again, as Joe said, Nia will be with us on State of the Union night to break down the speech itself, the response, all of it. Bloomberg opinion columnist Nia-Malika Henderson, thank you so much. And coming up, Democrats and Republicans remain at an impasse over funding for the Department of Homeland Security. We'll discuss the latest developments on this partial government shutdown with Democratic Congressman Suhas Subramanyam next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
And to think I have to be in the United States Supreme Court for many, many months waiting for a decision on tariffs. Without tariffs, this country would be in such trouble right now.
It's tired of waiting. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for being with us. President Trump there, of course, just moments ago, speaking in Rome, Georgia, specific to the impending Supreme Court decision that could impact the fate of his global tariff regime. The court is now weighing whether or not President Trump can use the 1977 IEEPA Act to impose import taxes. And the court's next opinion day is, guess what, tomorrow. Joining us now on the eve of what could be the decision day is Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr. Of course, we know that if this is struck down, he can simply do another investigation and find a different grounds for these same tariffs, right? So would that be a determining moment or not?
Well, the White House is saying it's going to try to replace whatever tariffs are struck down using different mechanisms. But even the president has said those are more cumbersome. It may not be complete coverage. It may be harder to do. They may be legally vulnerable. So if the Supreme Court rules against Donald Trump, unquestionably a big blow and will reduce his tariff authority.
Well, so there's the question of what the ruling will be. There is also the question, Greg, of when the ruling will be. If it's not tomorrow, knowing the State of the Union address is coming up on Tuesday and the justices of the Supreme Court will be there right before the president, how does that factor in here?
Yeah, so we have 3 opinion days we know of coming up. There's tomorrow, there's Tuesday, there's Wednesday. Wednesday, of course, is after the State of the Union. Chief Justice John Roberts is old enough to remember 2010 when the court issued the big Citizens United ruling, campaign finance, and the justices 6 days later went to the court and went to the Congress, and Barack Obama gave his State of the Union address and criticized that decision, and Democrats stood and cheered, and that is not a specter that they like. So I'm not saying for certain they're going to wait until then, but you could understand the logic of wanting to wait until after the State of the Union.
So definitely challenging optics there. What other possibilities could we have in a ruling, and would it necessarily include a demand for refunds if the tariffs are struck down?
Yeah, that refund question is definitely a big one. People are wondering about it. The court doesn't have to say anything. So they could strike down the tariffs, and this is most of Donald Trump's tariffs, including the so-called Liberation Day tariffs.
Yes.
It could uphold them all. It could split the difference and uphold some and strike down others. And then there's the question of what will they say about refunds if they strike them down. It came up a good deal in the argument, but it's not formally a question that's in front of the court. They don't have to say anything. They could just leave it to the lower courts to sort out how much people get back.
All right. It's going to be a busy few days for Greg Stohr. Maybe just a lot of waiting around for when it drops. Bloomberg's Greg Stohr, thank you so much for joining us. Now, we're also keeping an eye on the Middle East as President Trump is weighing whether or not to take action in Iran. Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna of California and Republican Congressman Tom Massey of Kentucky are planning to force a vote next week on a resolution to require authorization from Congress before the president can use military force against Iran. That's something we spoke about with their colleague, Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, earlier this week.
In an emergency situation, the president of the United States has the prerogative to defend our country, and that's a special situation. But where there is no emergency in the sense of the word as it's described in the War Powers Act or elsewhere, he needs to come to us. He needs to advise us. And of course, if he's going to deploy armed forces in any way, then he needs to get our consent, the consent of the American people.
Joining us now with his take is Democratic Congressman Suhas Subramanyam of Virginia. He serves on both the House Oversight Committee and the House Ethics Committee. Thank you, Congressman, for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. When we consider this notion of seeking congressional approval, does that not risk that it sends a signal to Iran that an attack is going to come, that there will be this declaration and therefore a use of force, and potentially make Iran decide to strike first and put American troops in harm's way?
Well, I think Iran is already preparing for an attack because of the troop movements. I think anyone with access to the internet can see that we are stationing troops in a manner that prepares us for an attack. I think it's incredibly important for this administration to consult with Congress, though, when it comes to the idea of basically starting a war with Iran. This is not a situation even like Venezuela, where you come and take out one person and it could change the leadership in a way that could perhaps be beneficial to us. I would say even in the case of Venezuela, that I don't think long term that's going to be a great idea. But certainly we want the Iranian people to determine their future. We want a democratic Iran in some way, but to have it start a war here, I think is a huge risk for us right now.
Well, it's going to obviously take some time. The president says he's got 10 days, maybe 2 weeks to make a decision on this, and that would allow enough time for a war powers vote to happen. What are you hearing from your colleagues? Are Democrats all on board? Would Republicans join you in that effort?
Well, certainly we have one Republican, and Thomas Massey, but we would need a few more. It's hard to tell because they would tell me one thing and then they will vote another way. And so it's hard to count votes on the Republican side these days. Absolutely.
Your Republican colleagues are not honest with you in the cloakroom when you're talking about future votes?
I know. They really should be. They should trust me. But, when President Trump calls them and tells them to vote with him, they often follow suit. So it's very difficult to predict the future on that.
Well, I'd like to ask you about something else that could or perhaps will not come up for a vote upon the return from recess, Congressman, which is continuing to fund the Department of Homeland Security. It doesn't really seem like your leadership or the White House are getting any closer to an agreement on reforms to ICE that would unlock funding for that agency. And we have some 260,000 people who could be affected, sir, in not receiving paychecks in a couple weeks. What is your expectation about what will happen, how quickly next week, if anything at all?
I'm surprised it's been this slow. I probably shouldn't be at this point, given government shutdowns are becoming a regular occurrence. I've tried to push legislation to prevent that from happening, prevent federal workers from suffering during these times. I have a lot of FEMA workers, for instance, and TSA employees in my district in Northern Virginia. So it's frustrating to see the pace by which these negotiations are happening. I will say that Democrats have put forward a very clear plan for what we want. I think it's quite reasonable. We just want some form of accountability and transparency with ICE and are willing to meet Republicans in the middle on things. But it seems like Republicans, again, are dragging their feet and not really coming to the table on this. And a lot of that is because of the White House not feeling a sense of urgency. I hope both sides, but particularly Republicans, will start to feel that sense of urgency, because the last time we had a shutdown, they had a blowout loss in Virginia this past November, and they should expect more political blowback if they don't work with us or try to work with us.
Well, if everyone's so far apart here and not budging on masking and on judicial warrants, is it time to carve out ICE? You know that ICE has money for the next 4 years, because TSA and FEMA are going to start running out of paychecks in less than 2 weeks. That will completely change the tenor of this debate, won't it?
I fully support that. If that was on the table, I would support that. Because, yes, the workers at FEMA and TSA and other agencies within the Department of Homeland Security should not suffer. I will say that part of this conversation is also the leadership at DHS, and particularly Secretary Noem, who should be out by now. She should resign in some form or be impeached.
Would that help you reach a deal if Republicans promised you new leadership at the agency?
That would certainly move the needle for me. I will say that if we're able to fund TSA and FEMA separately and keep the conversation about ICE separate, I would certainly be amenable to that. But we need to see changes. We can't just keep giving blank checks to DHS.
Well, as we talk about FEMA, Congressman, obviously it has been drawn into the politicization and the ongoing dispute between Maryland Governor Wes Moore and President Trump over the sewage leak into the Potomac River and who is going to be on the hook, essentially, for the cleanup of that spill. Obviously, it's not your exact district, but it is nearby. Are you working with local and state officials on this? What do you make of how political this public health hazard has become?
This is awful. And we were told that it's going to take 9 months to fix. That's unacceptable. So we need to use all the resources we can to fix this sooner, because people are relying on this to be cleaned up quickly. And it should not be political. But once again, the president has made something that should be bipartisan very political and partisan by going after the Maryland governor. I think not only is that wrong, but it's not even Maryland land. It's federal land. And so it is under the purview of the federal government, and we should be doing more. And so I'm working in a bipartisan way to try to figure out a way forward on this, and I'm working with our delegation locally. I hope we are able to get this done, but it has to be sooner than 9 months.
Well, we're showing pictures on TV right now that I'm loath to describe to our radio listeners, Congressman, so I'm going to turn to another mess, and that is the situation surrounding the release of the Epstein files. You sit on the Oversight Committee, which is, of course, directly associated with the release of thousands of files. And I know this has been an important issue for you, to the point where you've been over to the Department of Justice several times to review unredacted files. We've heard from the likes of Massey and Khanna that they are still redacted. We've also heard from other members that their keystrokes and other actions on these 4 computers were recorded, that their actions were being surveilled by the DOJ. Did you have that same experience?
Yes, they were basically giving us a unique username so that they could identify and keep track of all the searches we were making. They also limited the notes that we could take. I mean, it wasn't real oversight. And then half the things I was looking for were already redacted, and were still redacted when I went to find unredacted versions of them. And then they still have 2.5 million files that they haven't released. Look at what's happening today to the former Prince Andrew getting arrested. That's why this matters, is because this involved a lot of rich and powerful people, not just committing crimes against underage girls, but also committing major financial crimes, giving away state secrets, protecting people who are committing these heinous crimes and sex trafficking. So this matters because for so long now, for decades, we've been saying that everyone is accountable, but we haven't been holding the rich and powerful accountable. And in this case, we're finally seeing some movement, and the American people can perhaps start to trust law enforcement and their government to protect them in these situations. So we're going to continue our investigation because it does matter.
Well, Congressman, we do know that Prince Andrew, after being he was released under investigation earlier today after earlier being arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. It does come after questions around his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, though but we don't know for sure that they are leaked. And he does, of course, deny any wrongdoing. Aside from former British royalty, though, sir, I'd like to ask you about someone else who has been connected to this probe, at least via the Oversight Committee, and that is the former first couple and President Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. Their depositions are set for next week. Is there something specifically you are you are hoping to learn from them? What will we know as the public from that?
We wanted to make sure that this was not a partisan investigation. So when Republicans on the committee asked to speak to the Clintons, we agreed to that. We agreed to that subpoena. And the Clintons have been willing to do it. In fact, they're willing to do it publicly. Bill Clinton shows up in a couple of photos in the files that have been released so far. Epstein visited the White House many times, and Clinton's foundation used Epstein's plane several times. So I'm going to ask him what he knew about Epstein's crimes, if anything, whether he was involved in any way. Just ask him directly. I don't quite know why we're interviewing Hillary Clinton, because I don't think she has much involvement with Jeffrey Epstein. She said she never even met him. But Jeffrey Epstein was at Chelsea Clinton's wedding, so we'll ask about that as well.
Yeah. Congressman, I'm getting the hook here, but I have to ask you about next Tuesday night, State of the Union. I suspect you'll be in the chamber unless you tell me otherwise. And your governor, we just found out, Abigail Spanberger, is going to deliver the official Democratic response. You know the drill with that. That's a tough job. You know about the curse. What does she need to do to avoid the curse, if not simply avoid drinking water on the air?
No curse is going to stop Governor Spanberger. She's the future of our party. She's fantastic, dynamic. She's really united Virginians around her, not just Democrats, but independents and even some Republicans. And so I think she's going to strike the right balance between, kind of a positive vision forward and a pragmatism, as well as a response to President Trump, a forceful one. So I think she's the perfect person to do it. I'm proud that she's doing it.
You'll be in the chamber yourself?
I'll be in the chamber, yes.
All right, Congressman. Thanks for joining us. Suhas Subramanyam of Virginia. It's great to have you back on Bloomberg. Coming up, President Trump claiming that President Obama gave away classified information about aliens following a podcast interview where he confirmed their existence. We'll bring you the details and discuss with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We'll have much more on today's top stories when our political panel joins us up ahead. But first, here are the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. The U.S. notched one of its biggest annual trade gaps since 1960. Commerce Department data out today showing that the deficit widened in December to more than $70 billion, resulting in a full-year deficit of $901.5 billion. It's one of the largest in 60 years. Trade data, of course, was notably volatile in 2025 due to U.S. importers reacting to the various tariff announcements and retractions from President Trump.
Following a withdrawal from the World Health Organization, the Trump administration is now proposing a more expensive replacement. According to the Washington Washington Post. White House suggesting spending $2 billion a year on global disease surveillance and outbreak functions, services the U.S. previously accessed at a fraction of the cost from the WHO. While President Trump accused the organization of demanding unfairly onerous payments, the alternate pitch now carries a price tag about 3 times what the U.S. contributed annually to the health agency.
And Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, former prince and brother of the UK's King Charles, was released under investigation Thursday after being arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The arrest came after further details of his relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein emerged. Mountbatten Windsor has consistently denied any wrongdoing. King Charles III issued a statement outlining his, quote, deepest concern about the matter and promised Buckingham Palace's full and wholehearted support and cooperation with the investigating authorities.
Joining us now with their take on today's top stories, we've covered a lot this hour. This evening's political panel with Bloomberg politics contributor and Democratic strategist Adam Hodge, managing director at Bully Pulpit International, and Republican strategist Lisa Camuso-Miller, senior vice president at Rock Solutions. Great to see you both. Welcome back. Adam, I'm going to start with you as we hear from the president in Rome, Georgia, who said Democrats haven't been talking about affordability for about 2 weeks now because he solved the issue. Is that the message next week? And what's Democrats' response with the State of the Union?
If that's his message, I hope so, because Democrats are going to use it to pop more champagne and put it in more political ads. I mean, the reality is Democrats largely won a lot of the races in 2025 on this message. Abigail Spanberger, an inspired pick to give the State of the Union response, made that a key focus of her campaign. And I think it's an exact copycat of what you'll see Democrats do throughout the rest of this campaign, hammering on affordability, because it wins us races. That's the bottom line from politically. But I think also people can feel it in their pocketbooks when they go to the groceries, when they're trying to buy a house. The inflation may be cooling slightly, but it's up 2.4% year over year. And that means prices are still going up, which is not good for the president's politics.
Well, the president isn't up for re-election, though, Lisa. There are plenty of Republicans, though, that will be on ballots come November. If this is how the president wants to talk about affordability or perhaps doesn't want to talk about affordability, do you want him out there at all? Does this not hurt you if you're an incumbent Republican in a tough district?
The difficulty here is that for whatever reason, he has looked at economic data and decided that the word accountability or the word affordability is the word he does not want used. Democrats know it's working. Yeah. And the problem is that leaves the Republicans in the House and the Senate who are up for re-election trying to figure out what word they should use and ought to use in this case without getting themselves sideways with the president. And that, I think, is it's a tricky game, right? They don't want to get themselves in a place where the bully pulpit is speaking out against what they're saying, but they also don't want to sound tone deaf to the voters. And that, I think, is what's really happening on the ground in those campaigns where those issues really do matter.
What do you make of the narrative that Susie Wiles is chewing her nails, talking to the cabinet about affordability, and they can't turn the president away from foreign policy? Isn't that part of the president's job? Aren't candidates constantly trying to reinforce their foreign policy bona fides when they're trying to run?
Well, I think that, yes, to some degree, but I don't think that people go to the polls with the idea of what's happening overseas. Mm-hmm. I think fundamentally she's right to talk about why affordability still has to be a balance in everything else that's happening. I think next week at the State of the Union, you're going to hear the president talk a lot about foreign policy, and he's going to do what he's going to do.
And that's a
problem.
But
it's going to have to be balanced with a discussion about how it is they're making things better and more affordable in the economy, without sounding tone deaf.
This is something that we struggled with in the Biden administration. Yeah. Oftentimes, whether it was on selling the Affordable Inflation Reduction Act or any of the infrastructure spending or the CHIPS bill, that was always, you wanted that to be the thing you talked about every single hour of the day. The problem was you had Ukraine. You had other problems in the world that just do not sleep or do not care about America's domestic political issues. So I think that what the president is in a really tough place here, and I think that gives Democrats an opening, because you can, one, hammer him for being an expansionist president who's says he's chairman of the board of peace, but yet we've got wars sparking up with attacks in Iran.
Yeah.
And not dealing with the political issue at home of rising eggs, rising prices of chicken and beef that he's not solving. And so that is a great 1-2 for Democrats to hammer him on. I think you will see that in the months ahead.
Yeah, it's a good reminder, Adam, that President Biden's last State of the Union, what did he open with? Ukraine, of all things, in an election year, which was remarkable. But to this point, knowing that the president today said Iran has about 10 days for diplomacy to work. If not, perhaps he'll strike. We're hearing in the Wall Street Journal he may do a kind of preliminary strike to force them to the table. Would he be amiss to do that prior to the State of the Union address if he wants to address the American people on the economy, his MAGA America First base?
I think we come back to the fact that the president himself sees that victories overseas and victories on the global scale are legacy opportunities for him. And anytime we lose sight of the fact that the president looks at anything through the lens other than himself is wrongheaded. So he will talk about whatever it is he wants to talk about, but there will have to be some sort of setup and some sort of opportunity also where he talks about why it is those actions make sense here at home. And also, too, it's going to be interesting to see how Republicans themselves square themselves with the idea that the president's going to do something overseas without the granting of those powers from the Congress.
All right, let's talk about the real news. We talked about President Obama confirming the existence of aliens in a podcast interview just days ago. Prepare now for the investigation. Here's President Trump.
He gave classified information. He's not supposed to be doing that. You know?
So aliens are real?
Well, I don't know if they're real or not. I can tell you he gave classified information. He's not supposed to be doing that. He made a big mistake. He took it out of classified information.
Adam Hodge, you were in the national security space in the Biden White House. Is there something you need to tell us?
Sure, they're on Saturn. I mean, they're just hanging out there on the backside.
You put them on Saturn?
Yeah, sure, why not? I mean, I think the president also disclosing, if he's saying the classified information, he's confirming that the president said it. He's also disclosing classified information to the press on Air Force One. So strategically does not make any sense. Look, I think that it is, we can have some fun here. It is truly remarkable that we were the only things in this galaxy, right? In this solar space.
Yes.
That said, the president President Obama clearly felt like, okay, I said something probably in a flippant way. He clarified. But I don't know. Where do you think they are, Lisa? I mean, do you think they're maybe?
Look at him try to get this off his plate. That's all right.
I love that you kicked it over here, but I also think that President Trump is absolutely giddy with the idea that someone else has something that's classified and has said that out loud. I think he's happy to deflect much as this conversation has happened
maybe these were
today.
the files that were in the shower at Mar-a-Lago. I don't know. Maybe, that's why they wanted him back. I don't know.
But did we see this as being in jest? There's no investigation about to open up into Obama?
I mean, I wouldn't put it past this administration. Like the Justice Department, the way they went after Jerome Powell, the way they for Lisa Cook, I would not put. The president has been clear he will stick his Justice Department on his political enemy.
If it means learning once and for all, Kayleigh, come on.
Yeah, but his face is now up at the Justice Department, mind you. A literal banner with President Trump's headshot is now hanging between the columns.
Do we have that? Can we see that?
I think we did just show it on Bloomberg TV and YouTube. You can find the images online.
Is that the mugshot?
As well. It does look like the mugshot. Lisa Camusa Miller, Adam Hodge, thank you both so much for joining us. And, of course, for more coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Alongside Kayleigh Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.